In our last lecture, I introed the endocrine system and talked a little bit about what its job is and the different glands that make it up. And then we finished up by talking about the different types of hormones that exist. And I mentioned that there were steroid hormones and then there were non-steroid hormones, amines, protein hormones, peptides. And they really do the same thing in the sense that they trigger a reaction. They just do it a little bit differently. So we're going to kind of keep moving here and let's talk about how they do their jobs. So how do they actually work? So basically the way they work is very simple. Hormones are going to change some process and they're going to attach to these binding sites on the receptor cells. So I used the analogy in the last lecture of like calling somebody on a phone or like shouting out the window. Think of the hormone as being the words, like the voice, and then think of the receptors being ears. And when you say something, if somebody has ears, they're going to hear it, right? And if they're not listening or they don't have ears, they're not going to hear it. And that's essentially how hormones work. Hormones get released by the gland or cells that produce them, and then they're going to travel through the body until they eventually find their way to a binding site. And essentially, the way it works is pretty simple. The more binding sites you have, the more of a response you're going to get. So for example, if let's say somebody has more binding sites on their liver than somebody else, that means that insulin is going to have a bigger impact on their liver, right? More keys to open more doors. So the more binding sites you have, the better reaction you're going to get from a hormone. And then the other side of that coin is the less binding sites you have, the less reaction. So a lot of illnesses actually, I shouldn't say a lot, but some illnesses, some disease states are caused by a lack of receptors. So hormones can't do their job. Now the body will change with need, right? So there's two terms you should be familiar with. First one is upregulation. So upregulation is basically what happens there is the body starts to make more receptors. Now that's the thing you have to remember. These receptors are proteins, right? And those proteins get made by the cells. So let's say I'm a cell, right? Doesn't matter what kind of cell. I'm going to have receptors on the outside of my body that are going to be how things communicate with me. And if the hormone levels go down, let's say there's a problem and my hormone levels are down and I'm not able to work the way I need to, I'm going to make more of these protein channels, these receptors, to be on the outside of my body. That's called upregulation. So your body's going to make more of these receptors. And that happens with neurotransmitters as well. It's not just in hormones. This happens in your nervous system. Downregulation is the opposite. If you have an increase in hormonal levels, you're going to make less receptors because receptors stop working. And in order to make new ones, it takes energy. So one of the things I hope you understand from this class, one of the things I've been trying to kind of pound into your brains is this idea that nature doesn't like waste, right? We have to conserve our resources. And your body's not going to just make unnecessary proteins just to have them because that takes energy and energy takes resources. And we live in a resource, limited world. So the body's going to react. So if there's more of a certain type of hormone, then your body's going to make less of the receptors. That's called downregulation. And there's less of a certain type of hormone, you're going to get the opposite response. And that is also true of neurotransmitters, and that happens with neurotransmitters, and that's where addiction comes from. Because when you start to, overwhelm your body with these synthetic hormones or these synthetic neurotransmitters, your body's going to start to upregulate, and downregulate. You're going to have less receptors because your body has more hormones. But then when you stop taking that, synthetic hormone or synthetic neurotransmitter, now you don't have enough of those receptors and you're going to go into this, that's what addiction is. You need to always be getting more of it. But that's neither here nor there. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the differences between how they work. So steroid hormones work differently than non-steroid hormones. And it has to do with one thing, polarity, right? So one thing I hope you remember from your biology class and your chemistry class is that polarity has to do with the charge on this molecule, right? Is that if it's very polar, it's going to have an uneven charge, and you're going to end up being able to attract to things. And if it's nonpolar, it's going to have an equal charge, and it's not going to attract to anything. Think of oil versus water, right? Oil is nonpolar, water is very polar. Steroids are made of fats, and fats are nonpolar. So that really is what makes a difference there. So what gives steroids the ability to do their job so well is that they're fat soluble. And if you think back to your biology class, cells have a semi-permeable phospholipid bilayer, right? So what is the cell membrane? It's essentially a double layer of these phosphates, and in the middle you have this fatty layer. So think of your cell membrane as a fatty, essentially the way I teach it in biology is think of like a bubble. If you've ever blown a bubble before, like a soap bubble, that's a fatty bubble, right? That's what a cell membrane is. So steroids are able to go right through because water can't do that. ions can't do that because they are not fat soluble. So they need to go through a membrane protein. Steroids, on the other hand, are able to go right through the cell membrane and into the cell to do their job. So once inside, what they do is they bind with a protein receptor, and they form this thing called a hormone receptor complex. Now, it's not the same in every cell, obviously. Every cell's got a different type of, hormone receptor complex that's going to form depending on the cell. And then what ends up happening is this hormone receptor complex is then going to attach itself to the DNA, and it's going to cause the cell to start making these specific proteins, right? You've probably learned about biology class this idea of epigenetics. This is what we're talking about here, right? These proteins trigger the cell to make more proteins. So DNA is important. DNA is a recipe book, but DNA doesn't actually make the proteins happen. What makes the proteins happen is they get triggered by other proteins. So it's like, what is he talking about? Protein? Yeah, I'm sorry. I know it's late in the year, but that's how it works. So if you take a look here, what you have happening is the steroid is able to go right into the cell membrane. It doesn't need to go through a protein channel. It just goes right through the cell membrane, and it's going to attach itself to this receptor molecule. So this is going to be your steroid hormone here. It attaches to the receptor molecule. That triggers the receptor molecule to attach to the DNA, and that DNA is then going to trigger protein synthesis. And the mRNA is going to get copied, and it's going to go out to the endoplasmic reticulum, to the ribosomes, to make whatever protein it is. So it doesn't, it's different for every cell, but the process is still the same. Steroid goes right into the membrane, and it triggers this response. This is just another image of that. You can see the hormone coming in and triggering this response, making the mRNA, and then it's going to make the protein. So this protein got made because this hormone triggered the reaction. Now, in non-steroid hormones, it can't do that. In non-steroid hormones, these are not fat soluble, so they cannot pass through the cell membrane. They have to they have to actually attach to a membrane protein on the outside of the cell membrane. So this hormone is now going to bind to the target cell on the cell membrane of the target cell. And what that's going to do is it's going to cause, there's this binding site, right? And then there's a second site on these membrane proteins called an activity site. And the activity site is what triggers the response. And I'll explain it better on the diagram in a minute. But basically what happens is the hormone's going to bind to the binding site, and that's going to activate this other activity site on this protein. And that's going to then trigger another messenger. So this is what you've probably learned about. If you take AP Bio, you've learned this term. It's called cascade. This is a protein cascade, where one triggers the next, triggers the next. I'm not concerned with you really absorbing this information. I just want you to have a basic understanding of it. But basically, you have your first messenger, which is the hormone. And that first messenger is now going to cause another reaction, which is going to become the secondary messenger. So now the secondary messenger is no longer a hormone. The hormone just triggers the reaction, and it's like that game, of dominoes. One knocks over the next, knocks over the next. If you've ever done that before, that's essentially how this works, and that's why it's called a cascade. So the most common form of a secondary messenger is a molecule called cyclic AMP, and I'll talk again more about that in a minute. And the secondary messenger, basically, it's going to increase its amplitude, so it's going to become a bigger effect depending on the number of secondary messengers. So the more hormone, the more of a reaction. So if you take a look here, and again, I don't expect you to absorb all this, but I just want to explain it. So this is going to be your membrane protein, right? Your hormone is a non-steroid hormone, so it can't just go right in and do what it does. This is going to attach to this binding site, which is then going to trigger this this is the activity site here. That's going to trigger this secondary molecule to then trigger a reaction to make, this is the secondary messenger. This is the cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is essentially ATP that lost two phosphates. So you have ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It loses two phosphates and it becomes cyclic AMP. It's cyclic because it is now cyclic shaped, just like the steroid is. And now that is going to trigger this secondary action. So this is that cascade. So protein kinase is essentially, kinase just means movement. So a protein kinase is going to activate another protein, and then that's going to activate some change. So generally, you just need to understand the idea that a steroid hormone could have an immediate reaction. It just goes in, it causes the DNA to make the protein that it wants to make, where in a non-steroidal hormone, it has to basically attach to a primary binding site, which is going to be your binding site on the membrane protein, and that's going to trigger this cascade to occur. Okay, I'm going to just go a little bit more into this, and then we'll finish up. So how do we regulate our hormones? Well, That's done through negative feedback. So let's talk a little bit more about that. You don't want your hormones just hanging around in your blood, because let's say you get attacked, right? And your body releases epinephrine. That's the fight or flight response. And now you weren't really attacked. Let's say you watch a scary movie, right? And you get this, your heart rate goes up. You get scared. That causes your epinephrine to get released from your adrenal glands because your brain thinks you're being attacked, even though it's just happening in a movie. Well, what ends up happening now is that is in your blood, and you don't want it to stay in your blood because then it's going to keep triggering this reaction. So you want these hormones to break down rather quickly, and luckily they do. So we call it half-life. And just like with, when you learned about half-life in chemistry class, when you learned about radioactive material, half-life in this case just means how long does it take for half of the hormone to get pulled out of your blood. So most of these hormones have very short half-lives, and that's on purpose. You don't want them, like I said, hanging around and then triggering another reaction when your body doesn't want that to happen. So what it does is it allows us to turn things on and off very quickly because the hormones just don't last very long. And again, it's done through negative feedback. The more of the hormone you have, the less of it you make. And that's essentially how it works. And I'm going to finish up actually on that last slide. We're going to get into the specific glands in the next lecture. Thank you very much.